was actually all about understanding people. And so I built models and behaviors which changed the way the bank worked. Stayed there for 7 years. And I was 30 by the time I left and set up my first hedge fund, and 33 when I set up my second bigger hedge fund, which is an emerging market fund, which was great because we got to do anything you ever wanted to invest in. And the really super thing about, finance, especially then, it was adventurous. It paid you to think differently. So I remember we sold the high of the Asian crisis and we bought the bottom. We became #1 fund in the world by clipping that particular experience. You have people like Soros offering us money afterwards, which I refused. Remember his immortal words, but no one said no to me before. No, George, because your fee structure is so ridiculously cheap. Anyway, we didn't do so well initially in the Russian crisis. We ended up buying a little too early, and we experienced what it was like to get it all wrong and hold on to it for longer than you think. And I remember for months I was walking around my garden every morning thinking, how do we make such a hash of this? And we ended up, in fact, converting the whole portfolio into Russian principal bonds. And, there was no diversification. It was just a lot of principal bonds, which had started at 40. By the end of it, we owned them at about 6.5, and their price was 2. And we didn't look too smart. And then I remember one day, just when you'd truly given up hope, the price moved and it went 2, 3, 3, 4, 4, 5, 6, 7, through our break evens. And then we got most of it through 60s and 70s. It was an incredible trade. But it reminds you that in incredible trades, you're going to be a-consensual. And then essentially, as you're a-consensual, you're going to get it wrong unless you have beautiful timing methodology. And then you're going to eat shit for a period. And then you've got to decide whether you believe it or not. And we did the very same trade as the Big Short, funnily enough, in television. We didn't do it in the same instruments, but we did it nonetheless. And we made about the same amount, 84%, between 07 and 08. So those periods were really formative for me. But the thing that really, I think, shapes our conversation now is 9/11. And in 9/11, I remember watching those planes plow in. It was truly, awful to watch. And I remember thinking about the magnitude of what we'd witnessed. And I asked myself a question. And remember, it was in the age of the neoconservative movement. It was going to be, democracy forever, a decade of American democracy exported around the world, all of these neoconservative ideas. And I remember thinking, hang on a sec, what if that's actually an immune system failure? And if it's an immune system failure between two intelligence services that didn't share information, then what about it being the beginning of the decline of America? And how could I answer the question of was it or wasn't it? And I looked at all my price information. There's just not enough price information to model. So I thought, okay, I'm going to have to use the price modeling in psychology and invert a structure I use, which is an Elliott wave structure of 5 up and 3 down, and sublimate it into 3 and 2 in effect. So 3 pulses up and 2 pulses down, and give them psychologies. And then I decided to use wars as the clocks of empires. And funny enough, once I defined wars as not all the same, civil wars, wars of expansion, wars of contraction, suddenly it all fell out. And I understood this 5 stages of empire model. And I described it as regionalization, the first stage, driven usually by population expansion, and then a civil war, which lateralized society. And by lateralization, I mean makes it adaptive, and the lateral thinking people that build and break things and strategically think differently, build and expand the system non-linearly. So it becomes an exponential expansion. And then it reaches a point where it can't expand anymore, which is the end of the expansion phase and moves into maturity. And at that stage, the system is paying back an awful lot of its debt that it's incurred to build the USPs. It becomes a monster, starts to institutionalize its culture and architecture and bigger structures. And then the linear people who are good politicians start to edge out the lateral people because you don't need your adapters anymore. You're just so big, you dominate everything. And towards the top, there's another subtle civil war where the linear group thinking people displace, because they're better politicians, the lateral mavericks. And in fact, from that moment onwards, the system is in decline. It doesn't realize it, but it's ejected its adaptive agents. And only the momentum and scale of it covers up that particular decision point. And that leads to overextension, which if you look at it is you have too much commitment and too little revenue. And you basically are slowly croaking, but you don't realize it because you start to borrow money and you're so big and you're such a good bet, you can borrow quite a lot of money. And then an event like 9/11 comes along that reverses and accelerates the decline. And then things start to get really bad. Your system doesn't work. It becomes more linear. It prints money. And what we've seen in America since 9/11 is an extreme version of decline. Because our financial management is so sophisticated, we have printed enormous amounts of money. And the best way to look at it is, say, for example, you live in a world of no debt and you have a company that makes 10% per annum and the CEO looks great. And suddenly everything starts to slow down and they're making 5%. And the CEO doesn't look so good. So he just goes along and says, well, I'll double leverage what I make and I'll leverage everything we do. And now we'll make 10%. And everyone says, well, aren't you a great CEO? That's great. And then the next year, the real returns go to 2.5 and then you leverage it 4 times. And everyone says, well, you're brilliant. Well done. But what's happening is it's pasting over the need to adapt. It's pasting over the changing environment that would then create a change in leadership with a different perspective to adapt the system. And that's been happening not just in companies, it's been happening in especially America and European countries to a lesser degree. And we're probably 40 times leveraged, which means that what's underneath it is probably 0.001% of real growth. And if you've ever run a leveraged portfolio, the danger with that is one day you look hunky-dory and the next day you suddenly, it goes from positive to negative and it dives through the floor on you and it moves so quickly you can't actually respond. And I think that's the paradigm decline represents for the Western world right now. And then the other piece of that story is I stopped managing money. Well, before that, actually, I'm dyslexic, which is why I see patterns. Dyslexia is, is a thing.
Superpower.
Early years at school is a bugger, especially without a word checker, because I couldn't spell and therefore I couldn't really write and no one could read my stuff. Nowadays, for those that are dyslexic and myself, the spell checker takes the burden and actually it works. And people kept saying to me when I presented this worldview back in 2002 and 2003, and it was the basis of our investment thesis, they said, you must write a book. And I just laughed and I said, you know what, Steve, I'm never, ever going to write a book. I'm dyslexic. And then in 2005, my second and third children came along and they're twins. And I was feeding them at 1 a.m. in California thinking, Jesus Christ, how have I brought my children into this world that, if I'm right, is absolutely going to be at odds with each other? I've got to somehow try and show people what I've concluded and what it does. So the next day, and I'm not religious, I'm very spiritual, but I don't believe in religion. But there's a part that they talk about the gift of tongues, where suddenly people can communicate in different language. And for me, it was the gift of writing. Now, this wasn't writing that most normal people would do, but it was enough of a skill set where I could understand what I wrote the next day from the previous day, which was an advance. And that was the beginning of writing my book. And it finally came out in 2009. It was called Breaking the Code of History. And it details all the examples and dynamics of the 5 stages of empire applied. It predicted what would happen and has happened very accurately since then. And it also highlighted a cycle which, at that stage, I hadn't really adjusted, but it was Kondratyev's 54, 56-year commodity cycle, which is critical for anyone investing in the commodity sector. The thing that interested me was at each of those peaks, there was some kind of conflict. So conflict, inflation went hand in hand, and commodity dynamics and increase in prices went hand in hand with constriction. And that linked my profession of finance with my fascination with conflict. And I drew the conclusion that essentially, and this is back in 2002, when I picked the beginning of the commodity cycle, and we made a fortune from it, it was essentially that if we began, it would end. And if it ended, it would end with a conflict and what conflict would look like. And using my empire models, I predicted that America wasn't just in decline as a single country, that we lived in a thing I call the super Western Christian empire. And when I first started looking at empire models, they were simple. But the first complex model was the Roman Empire, because the Western Roman Empire based around Rome ran out of juice, and basically the Eastern Constantinople element became a separate empire for a time alongside it. And as the Western Roman Empire went into decline, the East rose. But they actually had very shared common values. They were Roman structures, and it was like the evergreen tree that gives birth to a branch that becomes the next tree. And so I call them a super empire. And I'd seen that in evidence and structured it. And then I asked the question why empires in Europe suffered shorter durations. And I thought it might be technology. But then I realized what they really were is the pistons of a bigger engine, with the Portuguese going first, then the Spanish, then the Dutch, then the French, then Britain, the biggest empire by far. And I laughed because, much as America may have seemed powerful at times, it didn't touch upon the power of Britain in the middle of the 19th century, not one bit. Britain didn't have a challenger anywhere in the world. It didn't live through a Cold War of bi-hemispheric power dynamics. And then America came along. Germany tried twice before that, once as a Christian society, secondly as an atheist society, and there is America. So when I highlighted America going to decline in 2002, just after 9/11, it wasn't just America was going to decline, it was a whole Western Christian value set, which is why you see democracy as a weakened value in many countries, because democracy underpins the process of Western structuring and leadership and organization. So here we were with this conclusion that America was declining and what was going to fill the gap. And then I looked across to the Asian structure and I realized that actually, in terms of modern recent cycles, I called Japan the first of the super Asian systems, and China was the second, and India is the third. And when you look at it that way, it makes an awful lot of sense as the center of economic gravity's moved to the east. And why that was important was, and this is incredibly arrogant, I would say, is that people in the West were saying to me, well, the Chinese will never challenge the West, ever. And I said, you do realize that the West has already had like one of these struggles with Japan. It started with Japan and Russia in the early wars. It then was the Second World War. So you've got to imagine this region's created rising hegemons, which have gone against Western power. And we've been here before. It's just a different country within the region replicating that. And that helped an awful lot for people to understand that you couldn't just discount the Chinese. And at that time, I'd done an awful lot of Chinese martial arts and I'd studied, Chinese culture, which is hugely admirable in so many ways and more sophisticated, I would say, than any other culture around, and complex and Machiavellian. And I warned that they had already made a plan after the third Taiwan Straits crisis and they were coming for us. But that was a more sophisticated coming for us. It wasn't, I'm coming out for you. What I'm doing is seducing you to invest in me, to build the biggest industrial base in the world that I'm going to use in an arms race to flatten you. And that was their plan. And anyone who went into China, anyone who thought it was a good investment, I was saying, if you do that, you betray our future. You betray our children's future. You feed the beast so it can then make the challenge into the next Kondratiev peak. And that's very important, because if we hadn't fed the beast, it wouldn't be ready to do it now. We still would be in a form of peace because the West would have dominant control and its IP would have been intact and we wouldn't have educated the enemy that's coming towards us. So there's an awful lot of things we've been really stupid about. And on the other side of that story, the Chinese have been incredibly clever. And their broad-fronted challenge to the West, whether it was industrial, whether it's economic, or whether it's military, has been incredibly frightening. And most people don't realize just how sophisticated and powerful and broad that challenge is and has been for, I'd say, the past 10 years.
David, that brings me to another book you've written, The Red Lightning. I believe you wrote that in 2021. You laid out a scenario where the West, or U.S. at least, the U.S.-China conflict, you would see sounds like a World War III sort of deal, conflict between U.S. and China by 2025. We're here in 25, global tensions running as high as they are. And how do you see that framework unfolding in real time, economically, militarily, through the lens of your, 5 stages of empire and Red Lightning?
So there's an awful lot of, subject matter inside Breaking the Code of History about warfare in its role of empire replacement and displacement. And then I wrote a book which seemed at the time a little bit left field for my other work. It was all about the First World War and how Britain in its BEF, the Expeditionary Force, had created a very adaptive form of warfare that broke the static lines behind which the Germans were, trying to advance but protecting their territory, even though they'd lost maritime control. And it was a story of innovation and adaptation. And I made some parallels to the Chinese. There are also some real parallels to what's happening in Ukraine. It's going through its static form of warfare, and everyone thinks it will remain static. And I would argue it will not remain static. There will be technologies and tactics which come out in combination, which suddenly create mobility and shock everyone. And we should be prepared for that. And we need to make sure it's Ukraine being mobile, not Russia. But then moving forwards, as the drumbeat built in its rhythm and tempo, I became more and more aware we were running out of time. So I wrote a defense review in 2015 after the disastrous review in the UK to try and say to people, look, if you don't spend money, we're going to be at war with Russia and China. And that missed.